Hi there, nerdlings. This is Ash.
And this is Matt. And you're listening to Crime Time Nerds, a sister podcast.
Today's case contains graphic details of murder, sexual assault, and violence. Listener discretion is advised. And now, nerdlings, let's grab our flashlights and join us as we venture down into the dark world of true crime together.
When folks talk about Israel Keyes, the first names mentioned are his known victims. We know that Bill and Lorraine Currier of Vermont were two of his previous victims. Samantha Koenig of Alaska was his final victim. Yet the rest of Israel Keyes' assumed 8 remaining victims are for the most part unknown. There is one possible victim, however, that investigators have linked to more than likely being Israel Keyes' 4th known victim. Her name was Debra Feldman. She was a 48-year-old woman who lived in Hackensack, New Jersey, who disappeared April 8th, 2009.
Debra Feldman was a woman who had struggled in her life. She had suffered from addiction issues, and in order to support her drug addiction, it was thought that she would often find work as a sex worker. She had lost custody of her son to his father a few years before she disappeared, and the relationship between mother and son had become strained after that time. She would move from place to place, drifting in and out of her son's life, as well as from town to town within Bergen County, New Jersey. Never really able to put down roots long-term anywhere. The last time Debra had been seen alive was April 8th, 2009. She wasn't immediately reported missing, as it wasn't unusual for her family members to go long lengths of time between hearing from her. They had honestly thought that she was living in Utah somewhere, possibly under the Witness Protection Program, based on a conversation they had with her before she disappeared. Israel Keyes is thought to have abducted and murdered Debra Feldman from Hackensack, New Jersey, on one of his frequent trips to the East Coast. Debra's bank accounts have not been touched since April of 2009, nor has anyone seen or heard from her since that time.
Investigators began to tie Debra Feldman to Israel Keyes in 2012 after he was caught and charged with the murder of Samantha Koenig. Keyes would tell investigators that he had killed less than 12 people, which gave them the idea that the number was around 11 victims in total. He had confessed to the murder of Bill and Lorraine Currier, as well as the murder of Samantha Koenig. We will be diving into the confessions and interrogations of Israel Keyes later on in the series. In hopes of discovering his other potential victims, investigators would take his known travel during the 14 years he was active and uncaught, and they would match it against possible unsolved murders and missing people from the known locations Keyes had been traveling to during those times. Investigators would show Keyes photo after photo of missing people, and he would respond with nope or no until a photo of Debra Feldman crossed his path. He would pause while looking at her photo and tell the investigators in Alaska that, quote, "I don't want to talk about her yet," unquote. This would give investigators the information they needed to start piecing together statements from Keyes and determining whether Debra Feldman was a possible victim of his. From previous interrogations with Keyes, he had confessed that he had abducted a woman from the East Coast on April 8th, 2009. He had then driven her to upstate New York and sexually assaulted and then murdered her there, burying her body somewhere in New York. Then Keyes had crossed from New York over into Vermont the next day and stayed in Colchester, before going back to Manchester, New Hampshire and flying out. Keyes would also confess to having robbed a bank in Tupper Lake, New York during that trip, after he had murdered his abducted victim. Piecing this confession Keyes had made with his reaction and the dates of Debra Feldman's disappearance gave investigators the knowledge they needed to assume that Debra Feldman was more than likely a victim of Israel Keyes back in 2009. Debra Feldman was thought to have been a sex worker, and Keyes was known to have frequented sex workers over the years. It is assumed that Israel Keyes would abduct Debra and then drive her to New York, where he would subsequently rape and murder her, burying her body in an unknown location. Debra Feldman's remains have never been found. Her family has never been able to bury her, and there are still many questions surrounding just how Israel Keyes could have found and abducted her. Debra Feldman never got the chance to see her son again. She never got the chance to maybe get clean and start her life over. She never got the chance at peace. Debra Feldman mattered, as did all of the victims of Israel Keyes. Her life mattered, she was important, and we can all hope that perhaps one day soon her remains will be found and she too can be laid to rest as she deserves to be. We're going to do a quick breakdown of Debra's case as well in this minisode, as we wanted to take the time to discuss her disappearance and draw attention to her case as well, as her remains have also never been found.
Well, after researching Israel Keyes for a while, this does seem to be in his MO, I guess you could say.
Yeah.
Between him taking Debra in New Jersey and then fleeing right to New York. Because we've noticed that he will commit a crime and then he'll turn right back around and quickly flee.
Yeah, he doesn't really like to stay in the location of where he committed the crime. He tends to flee is a good word. Yeah, he tends to flee.
Yes.
I'm surprised he took her with him. Typically, like what we saw in other cases, he didn't usually do that.
Yeah, it's... I really... Ugh. I just can't imagine what Debra went through from New Jersey to New York.
Because that's what we mapped it. It's like 5 hours in the car with the man who's abducted you.
Yeah, so that's pretty crazy, unless maybe, because as we saw with the couriers, he's known to lie. So maybe he lied to her. Maybe she actually was looking for a ride to New York, and he's like, "Oh, well, I'm going that way."
Oh yeah,
you know, because I've thought about that too.
He does lie a lot, so who knows what he told her? He's just I definitely do agree. I do think that Debra was more than likely the fourth victim. I definitely agree with that, especially after his reaction when investigators kind of pinned him down about it, when they were showing him all the different pictures of missing people based on the locations he'd been at. And then his reaction to Debra just says it all, where he's like, "Oh, well, I'm not ready to talk about it yet."
Yeah.
He's just, that's what he does. He wants that. It's almost like he baits them. Like he's like, "Oh, well, I'm going to get you interested in this, but then I'm not going to give you any more information than that." So at least that's why, after watching all of the interrogations with him, watching his reactions to things, reading the transcripts, all of that, this is definitely kind of what he does.
And then I also think about the other side of this. He could have just said that to get them on a different trail.
Oh,
you know?
Yeah.
I mean, all the pieces line up. This is just like me being the devil's advocate. But what if one of the other pictures, he was like, "Oh man, they do have that person. They do know about them, but I'm just gonna say it was this person to get them off my tail."
I mean, yeah, it's definitely possible because he didn't actually confess. He did not. It's just assumed. But
yeah,
personally, I lean towards yes, it is. But I could absolutely see that argument as well.
Yeah. It's really tough when you're dealing with
a liar.
With a liar. Yeah, it's
a sociopathic liar.
Yeah, because I mean, if he really wanted to mess with the interrogators, he could be like, "Well, I'm just gonna give them a little hint, but this is actually, I'm gonna make them do all this random searching and all this stuff for no reason to give me more time."
Do you think that if assuming he did abduct Debra Feldman, do you think that he actually buried her, or do you think he maybe did more like what he did with Samantha Koenig and put her in water, or do you think she's even in New York? What do you think?
I do believe if he did murder Debra Feldman, I do believe it was in New York, because New York is such a vast, like, woody area, especially when you get out of the city. If you're in, like, upstate, which is where his cabin was.
Right.
It's a crazy amount of wooded area. So Israel Keyes, that was where he was most comfortable, was in the woods. Personally, I do think he could have buried her, and that seems kind of like something that he would have done, because when you think about his kill kits, he went into the woods and buried them.
He did, yeah.
He just felt really comfortable in the woods, and I can't remember if he lived in that cabin at any point in New York, because it was, if you look at pictures online, it's a very rundown cabin.
Yeah, I don't think he ever lived there permanently. I think he used it more for, like, hunting and fishing.
Yeah. I mean, he probably knew the grounds very well, so.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. What do you think?
Well, I think he did, but I don't think he buried her anywhere near that location. With Israel, I go back and forth because he doesn't tell anything that he doesn't want to tell.
Yeah.
But I kind of go back to MO. And the one I go back to always is the one that we know for sure, which is Samantha Koenig, because her remains were found. She's the only one who's actually had her remains retrieved. He put her in water. Just the way he did it's very ritualistic, the way he went about her murder. And we'll get into that in a couple episodes. But when I think of Israel, I typically tend to lean towards he actually tends to put his victims in the water. That's just my thoughts. Purely speculation. There's no evidence that he had an MO for disposing of remains. There isn't. But I just kind of think that there's a lot of bodies of water between where he was, Tupper Lake area, to what we know the next day he went to Colchester and checked in. It's actually assumed that at that trip, after he had murdered Debra, when he was in Colchester in 2009, right after the next day, is when he buried the kill kit in the Runewski River area that he would have later then used to murder Bill and Lorraine Currier with. So, I don't know. To me, it seems like maybe he didn't bury Debra. Maybe he put her in a body of water. I could see that too.
Yeah.
I'm assuming they've probably had cadaver dogs and such all over any area where they think he could have possibly buried remains. I'm sure they did.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
But yeah, oof, man. After going to New York and hiking and camping and everything, you think Vermont is woodsy? Man, New York is all woods. It's pretty crazy.
Yeah. I mean, there are a lot of places he could have put anyone. So
yeah.
And he was very comfortable with the New England, New York area. So that's a thing that we all kind of tend to forget. He was going to areas he knew very well. He knows the woods. That is his thing. It's his comfort zone. So
yep.
I could absolutely agree. I can see both sides. I think water, but that's just me because I don't know. I just feel like he's lying about, he gets real shady about stuff, about how he gets rid of remains, how he inevitably kills the women. Like, he typically has gotten very, the only word I can think of is shady, but he gets very wiggy about those type of questions and doesn't like to answer them. He doesn't like to go too in-depth.
Yeah.
So I don't know if it's like baiting investigators or if it's because he doesn't want to share that. So I could see both ways, but I don't know. That's just my thought. I kind of lean towards he put her in water. Why do you think he didn't tell investigators just which state he actually abducted the East Coast victim from? All he would say is East Coast. Yeah,
that's strange. I don't know, because he did admit to murdering 4 people in Washington state.
Right.
So
he's like very specific about states, but then for this one, he just says East Coast.
Yeah. I don't know. Maybe it's because the East Coast, the states are smaller than they are in the West Coast. I don't if that makes any sense.
No, it does. I kind of actually thought that too, because I hate to say there's less missing persons cases.
Yeah.
But there are.
Yeah.
There's not as many. It doesn't happen as much here. It's really rural. So it might be that he knew it'd be easier for them to piece together who the victims were if he gave states. That's very possible. I think he may have been also saving it for leverage, because he was doing that a lot, where he was like, well, I'll tell you this one thing you really want to know if you give me X, Y, and Z things. So he thought he was a master negotiator. So a lot of his motive is absolutely because he's trying to get something for nothing.
Also, I believe because his brother lives in Maine, maybe it was somebody from Maine, and maybe he was just kind of sheltering his brother from that for some reason. I don't know. It is strange, because I do have a feeling that Israel Keyes came to the East Coast more than the investigators knew.
I do too. I would say it's a half and half. I think half of his victims were from the West Coast, half were from East Coast.
Yeah.
With the only exception being Samantha. I don't think he killed anybody else in Alaska. I think Samantha was the last.
Yep. Yeah.
And the only one, I should say. I feel like the remaining 10 victims, probably 5 from the West Coast, 5 from the East Coast. That's my theory. So are you leaning towards Debra Feldman was not a victim?
It's pretty hard. Ask me in a few episodes.
Fair.
I don't know. It's really telling that he said he didn't want to talk about her when they showed him the photo. But I guess because he's such a liar and manipulator, I don't 100% believe that he was true in those words when he said that.
Okay. So you're kind of on the fence.
I'm on the fence, yeah.
All right. I actually think for once we kind of disagree. I actually think she was. I think she was the 4th.
Yep.
Everything with her lines up. The day she disappeared, he was in the area. He had flown into Manchester. She's right on the way because if you look at it, the way Ash and I had mapped it was a circular pattern. So he flew into Manchester, rented a vehicle, so we know he did that. He put like over 1,000 miles on the vehicle, which if you're from this area, you know you can put 1,000 miles on by going through like pretty much going in a big circle. So start in Manchester, then go down to New Jersey, which is about 5-6 hours from New Hampshire, I think. Then abduct your victim, drive up another 5 or 6 hours back to New York, which isn't, unheard of. It's like I said, it's all small area. Then you would, in this case, murder your victim, then bury their remains. And then the next day, you drive 2 hours from upstate New York where he was to Colchester, Vermont. You bury your kill kit, and then you carry on the next day back to Manchester, New Hampshire, and give back the vehicle. So,
I completely forgot that we did that one night, that we mapped out the whole thing.
Yeah, we mapped it.
So it is helping me being convinced, but I don't know. He was just such an awful person and a liar and a manipulator. I don't know.
That's fair. I mean, he was definitely trying to leverage it for some reason.
Yeah.
And his words are very intentional. So
yep.
He was toying with investigators the whole time.
Oh, definitely.
Like you and I have said from the beginning, he didn't tell them anything he didn't want to tell them. So,
yep.
Well, I think that concludes our little mini-sode on Debra Feldman. We can all hope that one day soon, investigators will be able to give identities to each of Israel Keys' unknown victims. We can only hope that those families can finally get closure after never knowing just what happened to them.